now time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. 2021 was a year of new highs for South Korea's soft power, from hosting the Global Partnership for Growth Summit on climate action to transitioning from a middle-income economy to an advanced economy status. But these achievements were built on decades of global outreach and diplomacy for wider recognition of the country's potential to drive areas of global governance. For this, we speak to Ambassador Joon, who was at the forefront of these efforts and led Korea through significant diplomatic milestones. With more than 30 years in the Foreign Service, he was the former permanent representative of South Korea to the United Nations, and he is currently the chair of Save the Children Korea. He's also educating the next generation of diplomatic experts and leaders as a professor at Kyung University. Very warm welcome to you, Ambassador. It's lovely to have you back with us.
Morning, Suyong. It's good to be back.
Well, it's been quite a memorable year for South Korea upon its 30th anniversary of joining the United Nations. And while the occasion was made all the more meaningful as the UN Conference on Trade and Development this year, they changed the country's status to a developed economy. Now, what is the significance of this status, and also what kind of role do you see Korea playing as a more recognized power in the international community?
Well, the new UNCTAD status, in a way, has the effect of finalizing the process for South Korea to transit itself from a developing country to a developed one. If you think about it, actually, the process has taken almost 30 years because South Korea graduated from an aid recipient and joined the OECD, a club of rich countries, in 1996. But when it comes to the trade-related organizations, it has taken more time for South Korea. It has taken more time for South Korea to be recognized as a developed country. So I think now, Korea should make more efforts to live up to its new status and contribute more to the common good of the international community.
Definitely a big year for South Korea, and a lot of expectations, anticipation on how it's going to really continue to play its role and live up to its status, as you said, in the world community. And, well, there was a great amount of excitement leading up to the UN's General Assembly this year, mostly due to South Korean boy band BTS's participation in an event that highlighted progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. How has South Korea been contributing to the sustainable development of communities around the world, really based on its own development experience?
Well, BTS participation in the UN General Assembly, I think, reflects South Korea's enhanced soft power in recent years, as you pointed out. That's thanks to the successes of K-pop music and also K-movies, for example, including The Parasite and The Squid Game. The United Nations event was held to highlight the importance of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, not least when the whole world is trying to overcome the struggle for the last 2 years to fight the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So when it comes to development goals, as I said earlier, South Korea has a great deal to share with the international community based on its own development experience, as well as the lessons learned in the process.
And while South Korea has also been trying to step up its climate diplomacy, what are some important milestones that the country has made so far, and what role do you see it playing to help the whole world go towards a carbon neutral future?
Well, this year, South Korea announced its new reduction target for carbon emissions at the climate change conference held in Scotland last November, which is to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030 below 2018 levels. This target is a significant improvement compared to our original commitment in the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015. And South Korea also released the 2050 carbon neutrality scenarios last October. But according to specialists on climate action, this is not enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But still, I think this year's announcements provide a good ground to build on so that we can come up with more ambitious roadmaps at the future opportunities in global climate action.
And also, Ambassador, recently we've been experiencing a time of geopolitical uncertainty, and some societies are all the more vulnerable to autocratic takeovers and the deprivation of their fundamental liberties. The reversal of democracy in Myanmar and Afghanistan this year, this casts strong scepticism over the West's willingness to defend liberal values. Now, while the UN has delayed the recognition of Myanmar's junta and the Taliban's designated envoys to the UN this month, is there anything more that it can do as an institution to really pressure these two regimes? What kind of coordinated effort do you hope to see?
Well, there are things that the international community can do and cannot do about these countries. What kind of political system a country chooses to have is considered domestic affairs, and the United Nations is not supposed to intervene in them. But protection of human rights is one of the key tasks for the United Nations, and we should not just sit and watch human rights violations taking place in these countries. The Security Council has already expressed concerns over the situations, and other human rights bodies, both within and outside the UN system, are raising voices and adding pressure on these governments. South Korea, as a country that experienced its own human rights violations in the past, should also play an active role in these international watchdog activities.
And as the world also experiences this hegemonic rivalry in the world, the US is turning to its allies, and it's increasingly mentioning the formation of multilateral groups in order to protect regional security and also foster cooperation. Amid such efforts, how should South Korea engage with such initiatives to really strengthen its own position amid all this geopolitical rivalry and uncertainties?
This is not an easy issue for South Korea, as it has a great deal to do with increasing US-China rivalry in this region. But I think the bottom line should be that South Korea's national security is based on the bedrock of its military alliance with the United States. Therefore, which multilateral groups South Korea will choose to join or not join might be more operational issues. South Korea's security policies need to be always coordinated with its ally, the United States.
Well, the importance of multilateralism has been emphasized when it comes to resolving the threat from North Korea. And it's quite clear that there are differences in the priorities and methods between Seoul, Washington, Pyongyang, and also Beijing. What do you think is the best starting point, and what should be the clear goal of any multilateral approach to this problem?
Well, right now it is impossible to discuss threats from North Korea without addressing the North Korean nuclear issue. There used to be a multilateral approach to tackle this issue, which was called the six-party talks. But for the last 15 years, the issue has been largely left to the bilateral talks between the United States and North Korea, which are now stuck. Maybe it's time for related countries to think about reviving a multilateral approach with a view to achieving denuclearization. But at the same time, I think we should also remember that there is a kind of constant factor here, which is the United Nations sanctions on North Korea which is based on Security Council resolution, and that is certainly also a multilateral approach.
Well, there's recently been talk of a peace declaration between the two Koreas, which would also have to be agreed upon by the United States and China. And there have been varying degrees of enthusiasm and concern over this idea. What is your view on this?
Well, there have been a lot of talks about the possible declaration, as you just mentioned, declaration to end the war, because the Korean War was stopped 65 years ago with an armistice instead of a peace treaty. A declaration cannot replace a peace treaty, legally speaking, but it could serve as a confirmation by the parties concerned of a willingness to get back to dialogue instead of continuing confrontation. As was reported earlier, according to the South Korean foreign minister yesterday, the United States and South Korea virtually agreed to pursue a declaration. But I'm not sure if North Korea is ready to go for it, especially considering that the declaration would be virtually taken as a sign for resuming the denuclearization talks.
Well, now, Ambassador, you've devoted more than 2/3 of your time in the Foreign Service to multilateral diplomacy, and you achieved key moments in Korea's diplomatic history, such as its transition from an aid recipient to a donor country at the OECD. You also chaired the Economic and Social Council when you were the country's permanent ambassador to the United Nations. And well, what kept you motivated as you worked for the wider recognition of the country's role in the international community?
Well, my diplomatic service over 30-some years coincided with the growth of South Korea as a nation. When I started out as a Korean diplomat, there was not much South Korea could do to contribute to the international community. And therefore, multilateral diplomacy didn't mean much either. Even in the United Nations, we only took care of issues that directly concerned our own interests. But as South Korea grew economically and politically, we were able to expand our role in the international community. Our diplomacy became wider and more diverse, both in pursuing our national interest and in contributing to the world. I think I have been lucky to be part of that process.
Well, you paved the way, really, for the process for Korean diplomacy and really solidified its place in the world today. What do you then hope to see from the next generation of Korean diplomats, envoys, and maybe even representatives like BTS?
Well, I would like to see the next generation of Korean diplomats working more for the strengthening of global governance. By the term global governance, I do not just mean what the United Nations or other international organizations are doing. I would rather mean that we need more effective global cooperation to deal with mounting global challenges such as the pandemic or climate change. But unfortunately, we are stuck in the nation-state system in which countries and their political leaders concern themselves with more myopic national interests rather than the future of the whole world and entire humanity. Therefore, I believe for the next generation of diplomats, not just Korean, but of any country, it will be critically important to be open-minded and seek common good for all humanity.
Well, that's where we must leave this interview today. Ambassador Joon, thank you so much for joining us today and have a very happy New Year.
Thank you. Likewise.